Hi, this is Nick Veach from Debunkster. Today I want to take a look at a New York Times article. Again, this is how Britain went to war with China over opium. It's basically an email essay or an interview conducted by email with Professor Stephen R. Platt, who did a book, I think it's last year. I've read so much stuff, it all kind of runs together. Anyway, just want to take a quick look at one sentence here. This one right here. As William Gladstone wrote in his diary at the time, I am in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. Now, that was a new sentence, but I mean, I knew Gladstone had said this kind of tripe before. You can find something else he said here in Wikipedia's section. William Edward Gladstone, blah blah blah. If we come down here, my fading eyes, just jump that up a little bit so I can see it. And you have here words along the same lines. A famous speech was made by Gladstone in Parliament against the First Opium War. Gladstone criticized it as a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress. To cover this country with permanent disgrace was never seen. Okay, so, and then there's his hostility to opium stemmed from the effects of opium upon his sister Helen. I looked into that a little bit. Apparently, his sister Helen really didn't hate the family, as far as I can tell, and one of the ways in which she rebelled, because she was more of a kind of a free-spirited woman in a time, in a family, actually, because, I mean, you could be much more of a feminist, I suppose, for lack of a better term, at that period in history, but this is a particular family that was really buttoned down and really kind of patriarchal. And she rebelled in part by, chasing the dragon just to piss off her family. That was what I got from it. And you'll be saying, well, you might be wondering, upon what do I base the idea that his family was kind of buttoned down, patriarchal, and old-fashioned? Well, Gladstone's party basically was what would become the Conservative Party. And well, I mean, even before I get to that, I should just point out. So you have Gladstone here saying the war was more unjust in its origin, more calculated, blah, 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 but to cover us in permanent disgrace and all the rest of it. Okay. The war was started by the Tories, if I remember correctly, the Whigs, excuse me, right? Which is Palmerston and all the rest of it. Halfway through the war, their party fell in Parliament, okay? And Gladstone's party rose into power, what would later become the Conservative Party. Now, he hated opium. His party, campaigned or was opposed to the Opium War. Okay, so in the middle of the war, they have the reins of power in their hands. They can do anything they want. Did they stop the Opium War? No, they kept going. Okay, who do you think negotiated the so-called, what do you call the Buping Dung Tao? What do you call that in English? The unequal treaties. Gladstone's party. Who do you think demanded compensation for the opium that had been destroyed? Gladstone's party. Okay, so keep in mind, politics is politics. It's always been this way. Parties will oppose one. The Democrats, for example, in the United States, they used to be for a wall, for building up a wall to keep out illegal immigrants. Now they're opposed to a wall. If the role was reversed, who knows? Maybe it would be exactly the opposite. Maybe if right now the Democrats are in power, and they were for building a wall, and then maybe the Republicans would be opposed to the wall. I mean, who knows? Okay. But this is just part of politics. So to take Gladstone seriously on the face of it, saying that he was totally opposed to opium, you really have to wonder. To take that with a huge grain of salt. Also, the more you learn about Gladstone, the more you begin to think, well, wait a minute, who is this guy? Because you're presuming that if he's opposed to opium, that he must be some guy who wants to liberate humanity from the trammels of everything. I mean, you want to emancipate people from drugs, from economic oppression, whatever. But when you look into it, what do you find? Well, let's see. This is a time. One of the things that drew me into the whole Opium War issue was this curious kind of incongruence. In the 1830s, the Brits emancipated their slaves. They freed all the slaves throughout the dominions in about 1831 or 32, whatever else, all through. It was a gradual process, if I remember correctly. They spent about £20 million, which was a huge amount of money at the time. right? Then there was a as you would expect in this being a democracy, there was an anti-slavery faction, which was the people who fought the Opium War, which is Palmerston and Eliot. Okay, Palmerston who was a foreign minister. For him, fighting slavery in any way, shape, or form was something which he was totally dedicated to, and pursued for decades. And Eliot, for example, was totally opposed to slavery, and he was originally he was a captain who helped man the West Africa Squadron, which is a squadron dedicated to interdicting slave ships on the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, after which he was then employed as the the protector of slaves in British Guiana. That was his job before he was moved over to China. Okay, so he delivered materials before the House of Commons in favor of liberating slaves, and he was also very opposed to the opium trade as well, even though he was actually put in charge of supervising it. Irony of ironies. But anyway, so you basically have the anti-slave people, who are the people who prosecute the Opium War, who fight the Opium War, and these people are opposed by the pro-slavery people. And what do we learn about Gladstone? In the House of Commons, Gladstone was initially a disciple of high Toryism, blah, 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 but he was a son of one of the largest slaveholding families in the world, and Gladstone opposed the abolition of slavery. Gladstone's father was a slave owner, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I took a look, and that's exactly what I found. For example, here we go. I thought I had this. Okay, let's just take it to here. I guess is good enough. I thought I highlighted this earlier. Okay, the Gladstone firm was. Here we go. The Gladstone firm was mainly in East India House. Who cares? But in the last 10 years, it was mercantile course. John Gladstone, that's William Ewart Gladstone's father, became the owner of extensive plantations of sugar and coffee in the West Indies, some in Jamaica, others in British Guiana, or Demerara. Like I was saying, Eliot was he was stationed in British Guiana, and the person he worked for was Lord Howick, who will probably come up later in this video as well. In 1823, an outbreak of slaves occurred in Demerara, and one of John Gladstone's plantations happened to be its center. The rising was stamped out with great cruelty in 3 days. Now, this is written by a guy who loves Gladstone. This is the biography. It's not written by somebody who hates Gladstone. This is a 3-volume, 2,000-page biography of Gladstone. Okay, it's a labor of love, but he's just laying out the truth. The rising was stamped out with great cruelty in 3 days. Martial law, the savage instrument of race passion, was kept in force for over 5 months. 50 Negroes were hanged. Many were shot down in the thickets. Others were torn in pieces by the lash of the cart whip. Right. So, okay, let me continue in this vein just for a little bit more. In 1830, John Gladstone published a pamphlet in the form of a letter to Sir Robert Peel to explain that Negroes were happier when forced to work, as their labor was essential to the welfare of the colonies. He considered the difficulties in the way of emancipation insurmountable, that it was not for him to seek to destroy a system that an overruling providence has seen fit to permit in certain climates since the very formation of society. And Gladstone apparently took his cues from a thinker by the name of Canning. I've been, too lazy to look up rather than to quote this book, because otherwise I spent so much time doing the research for these things. I think it's just crazy. I was bred, said Mr. Gladstone, when risen to meridian splendor. As I said, this is a biographer who likes Gladstone, who approves of him, but he's showing him warts and all. I was bred, said Mr. Gladstone, under the shadow of the great name of Canning. Every influence connected with that name governed the politics of my childhood and of my youth. And what did Canning have to say about slavery? In 1823, Canning had formally laid down the neutral principles common to the statesmen of the day, that amelioration of the lot of the Negro slave was the utmost limit of action. In other words, you could be kinder to black slaves. You could not work them so hard, but that was the utmost limit of action, that's the utmost limit of emancipation or liberation or liberalism or whatever you want to call it that you were willing to go to. Okay. Canning described the Negro as being with the form of a man and the intellect of a child, to turn him loose in the manhood of his physical strength and the maturity of his physical passions, but in the infancy of his uninstructed reason would be to raise up a creature resembling the splendid fiction of a recent romance, the hero of which constructs a human form with all the corporal capabilities of a man, but being unable to impart to the work of his hands a perception of right and wrong, he finds too late that he has only created a more than mortal power of doing mischief. In other words, you're creating a Frankenstein. And so, when he started running for political office, he ran basically on a plank of a system of Christian instruction for the West Indian slaves, but no emancipation until that instruction had fitted them for it, which could be how long? Weeks, months, years, decades, forever. Not to worry, the anti-slavery men fought him stoutly. They put his name into their black schedule with 9 and 20 other candidates. They harried him with posers from a pamphlet of his father's, and they met his doctrine. In other words, this is Gladstone's doctrine. If slavery were sinful, the Bible would not have commended the regulation of it. And then the author of this friendly biography says, "We cannot be surprised that any adherent of these standard sophistries." Sophistries. Okay. But not to worry, because in his dealings with various antagonists, various counterpunchers, whatever, he shone not only in his powers of conversation, but by the tact, quickness, and talent with which he made his replies. And so, Mr. Gladstone, though mocked as a mere schoolboy and fiercely assailed as a slavery man, meaning a pro-slavery man, he exhibited from the first hour of the fight tremendous gifts of speech and skill of fence. I'm beginning to think this biographer is pro-slavery. Okay, to bring this back to the Opium War, let's check this out. The occasion of Mr. Gladstone's first speech in the House of Commons, whatever, I presume, was an attack by Lord Howick on the manager of John Gladstone's Demerara estates, whom he denounced as the murderer of slaves, an attack made without notice to the 2 sons of the incriminated proprietor sitting in front of him. He declared that the slaves on the Reed and Hoop's sugar plantations were systematically worked to death in order to increase the crop. Okay, so who's Lord Howick? Lord Howick was the superior of Charles Eliot. Who's Charles Eliot? Charles Eliot was the superintendent of the opium trade, the guy who was very vocal and public about his opposition to the opium trade, but was nevertheless put in charge of it because somebody needed to fill the position. Eliot didn't even want it. He felt he was being demoted. He almost refused it, but he needed the money, so he took it anyway. But in his previous position, he was in British Guiana, which is the home of some of the estates of the Gladstones, or some of the slave plantations of the Gladstones. He wrote to Lord Howick in early 1832. This is Charles Eliot. Right, this is Eliot talking again. This is one of the pro-Opium War people. Okay, to be contrasted with Gladstone, who was an anti-Opium War but pro-slavery. The people who are pro-Opium War are anti-slavery, which should give you an idea of where you want to kind of side on this when it comes to the war. Do you want to side on the pro-war or the anti-war approach? Well, I guess I take a cue from this. Are you pro-slavery or anti-slavery? If you're pro-slavery, then you're opposed to the war, and if you're anti-slavery, then you're for the war. Seriously, this is what kind of gave me my cue. One of the things that gave me my cues early on was this crazy situation. Anyway, so Eliot wrote to Howick, "As to my office, it is a delusion. There is no protection for the slave population. I am desperately unpopular with the slave holders." In a letter to his wife, Eliot wrote, "The slaveholders sometimes forget that slaves are their fellow creatures and that their lives are protected by the laws of England and the colonies." In October of 1832, later in the same year, I wrote, he intemperately mansplained to Howick, "It is the merest nonsense to suppose that the slaves are not keenly alive to the painfulness and injustice of their situation." More insights into the party that was opposed to the Opium War. The Prime Minister under whom Gladstone, from whom Gladstone took his marching orders in the House of Commons, was Peel. Peel in 1833 would have nothing to do with either immediate emancipation or gradual. He was also pro-slavery. Okay, That's Benjamin Disraeli has put his view on deliberate record that the movement. Excuse me, we're going to change here. Disraeli has put his view on deliberate record that the movement of the middle class for the abolition of slavery was virtuous, but it was not wise. It was an ignorant movement. The history of the abolition of slavery by the English and its consequences would be a narrative of ignorance, injustice, blundering, waste, and havoc, not easily paralleled in the history of mankind. These are the people who opposed the Opium War. Okay? But, maybe it's just a blind spot. Well, let's take a look. What did Gladstone have to say about admitting Jews to Parliament? Well, he fought steadily against the admission of Jews to Parliament. Oh. He also resisted a motion of Hume's for the abolition of all flogging in the army, except for mutiny and drunkenness. So, okay, it's like I mentioned before with the way in which with a sister rebelling against the family, she thought they were all horrible people. That was my reading from it. And she rebelled by flaunting their ban on her basically enjoying herself. I mean, she was supposed to be this prim, and you're supposed to be kind of seen not heard kind of approach in the Gladstone family, which is awful. And she just like I say, she rebelled in any way, shape or form that she could. One was by, like I say, instead of becoming an alcoholic, she became an opium user, and maybe she did become an addict in the end. I don't know, but anyway. Okay, to wrap things up. So what I'm getting at basically is people like to quote William Gladstone because they presume it's he must be this upstanding good Samaritan type guy. He's this kind of lone kind of white knight. He's a beacon of light in a dark era, Victorian era. Hence his famous line, "I am in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China," and so forth. But now that you're aware of who he is, what you should keep in mind then is that if you're pro-Gladstone, then you're basically taking the viewpoint that the guy who was pro-slavery, pro-flogging, pro-keeping Jews out of Parliament, he's my man. If he says Opium War was a bad deal, was a terrible campaign which oppressed the Chinese with drugs and it was all about chasing dollars. If in other words, this guy's judgment is just not to be trusted. This guy in many regards is a bad actor. He's behind. Instead of in front of the ball, he's behind the ball. Instead of being a visionary, a seer, a guy who's at the vanguard of progress, he's a reactionary. It was reactionaries who were opposed to the Opium War, and I would argue today the people who oppose the Opium War are also reactionaries, as I'll make clear in a number of other videos. Anyway, I hope I've said something useful and that you'll find informative when it comes to debating people on the Opium War, and I'll see you again in a later video. Thanks. Nick, out.